Yes, good afternoon. My name is Gregor Dutz. I work at the University of Hamburg in the Department for Adult Education, and my topic for this presentation is if the literacy practices have changed between the first cycle of PIAAC and the second cycle of PIAAC. I've prepared an agenda, but I will skip it to save some time, and we'll have a few words on the theoretical background. When you were in the other session chaired by Taka, you already heard about the practice engagement theory, so I will only say explain it very briefly. So what it means is that literacy develops through participation in everyday reading and writing practices, but it also works the other way around, so literacy also shapes the level of engagement in such practices. And that is, among others, supported by data from the longitudinal expansion of the PIAAC survey in Germany. When the first cycle of PIAAC was published, there was a discussion that was a bit similar to today because there were also many countries where literacy stagnated or declined over the years, compared especially to the IALS survey in the 90s. And one explanation for the decline or stagnation, although there was expansion of education in a lot of countries and also technological progress, was the decline in engagement in reading practices or literacy practices. And now in cycle 2, as we all know and just heard again, there's a stagnation or even decrease in literacy in many countries. So that brought me to my rather simple research question: are literacy practices still on the decline? In PIAAC, there are some measures that measure skill use, and I will focus today on the read home and read work measures, scales, and on the practices that are included in those measures, mostly for the reason that these are also trend scales, so that's quite useful when you want to compare the data between the cycles. We can already see when we're looking in the technical report that, and that's the red square, when we're looking at the scales measuring the skill use, read home and read work, that there seems for read home because these are trend scales, and in the first PIAAC cycle the scales were scaled to a mean of 2 and a standard deviation of 1. We can already see here that the read home seems over all countries, reading at home seems to be increasing, and reading at work seems to be, yeah, yeah, you know what I mean. And we can also see at the general relationship between literacy on the y-axis and the scales on the x-axis, that there's in most countries a positive, or overall countries a positive relationship between the mean literacy level and the reading engagement. Now we will come to a few figures that always look at this, and we are mostly interested in the red bars because the red bars shows the difference or the change between the two cycles. And I ordered all figures by the amount of the change, so the countries on the bottom will change now when I come to the next slides. But to guide you a little bit, I also highlighted a few countries, and those are the 3 countries with the highest increase in literacy from PIAAC 1 to PIAAC 2, and those are Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, and I also highlighted the countries with the highest decline in literacy. And perhaps you might see a pattern emerge, but take something, I think you won't see a pattern, so that's one of the results we will come to. But now this is are the changes for the read home index, and we can see that in more countries this indices has increased than it has decreased. And we will now, but also we had yesterday the discussion with Eduard Stöger and also beforehand that it's really, and also on the Big Five discussion, that it can be sometimes useful to look in detail what the measure is made up. So we will now look at the different reading practices. And again, I have highlighted the countries on the bottom, and we can see here that directions now the change is of course not the index, a change in the index, but it is the change in the proportion of the share of people who at least do these practices once a week. We can see that compared to cycle 1 and cycle 2, reading the directions or instructions at home is something that is done more often than before. When we're looking at letters, memos, and emails, we can see a similar picture. In most countries, this practice is done more often than in the cycle before. But now when we are looking at newspapers and magazines, we can see in all countries and sometimes a very strong decrease in this practice. So people are not longer reading newspapers or magazines. I forgot to mention the gray and the light blue bar are the absolute shares for both cycles in the countries. And when it comes to reading books at home, the picture is not quite clear, but there are more countries where there's a significant decline in reading a book at least once a week. Manuals or reference materials, we have positive development, and when it comes to financial statements, which is also part of the scale, there's also a positive development. And those were the practices all reading at home, and now we come to the practices, or first to the read work index, and I think I mixed up the title of the figure there, so it should read work. And we can see here when it comes to reading at work and this index read home that there's a decrease in this index, though that means that in most countries reading at work is going down. And we will now again look at the practices in detail. And we see a similar picture for the reading at work, like reading at home. So for directions or instructions, reading at work, it goes up. The same for reading letters, memos, and emails. In more or less all countries, this goes up. But also reading newspapers or magazines at work, that's very similar to the reading newspapers or magazines at home. It's also decreasing. Reading at work manuals or reference materials, again, we have a positive development, and reading financial statements, very little changes, but in more countries than not, positive change compared to PIAAC Cycle 1. And because there were a lot of figures, I have prepared a summary table, and and you can see where it's green and a plus, has been a positive development, and as you can see, there's no difference between home and work. Of course, that does not mean that it can be a country where it's a different development, but over all countries we have the same development. And I would say that reading longer and more complex texts is decreasing. I think that's more or less in line what we discussed yesterday already, and but that reading shorter and less complex text is not declining. I also tried to look at changes and comparing two groups, and here I'm looking at those changes for those who are at literacy level 1 and below. That's on the x-axis, and those level 2 and above that is the y-axis. And I wanted to know if there are different developments in the countries. And I should have drawn a line here to show where there are differences or not, but I think and the scale of the axis is also not perfect here to show it. But I would say that there are, when we are looking at the read-home measure, the read-home scale, that there are no or just very little differences between those two groups. But what stood out to me is when we are looking at differences in the read-work measure, that there we can see that in a lot of countries, people who are level 1 or below have a much more negative development of reading at work than those on level 2 and above. I also tried to look at those, so if the test language and the native language, so if the test language is the native language, and for the group where that's not the case, there I didn't find those differences for read home and also not for read work. Here you could look at the countries which are on the, does it work? Yeah, which are here, because there that would indicate that there is a positive development in engagement and reading at work for those where the test language is not the native language. Yeah, that brings me to the results and a short summary, and back to my research questions. Are literacy practices still on decline? I would say from the results, and of course these are only descriptive results for now, that reading in everyday life, so reading at home, is not declining, or what is called read home, and reading at work is declining in most countries. But that's just the overall trend, and we have to look at the countries in detail, because there are large differences. Also, there are differences in the practices, and I would say that that we are reading fewer long texts and complex texts, and reading shorter texts. I think Andreas Schleicher also just mentioned that in his talk. I also, in hindsight, I should have included a figure for that, but I didn't know if I had time for that. But perhaps you noticed the countries I highlighted, and I think there is no pattern. So changes in literacy do not appear, at least at first glance, to be accompanied by changes in reading engagement at the country level. And what really is interesting, and I think I will look deeper in it, is that adults at level 1 and below show a greater decline in reading at work. And some open questions or some possible questions for better or improved PIAAC are what are adults doing instead of reading? So I think in some cases it makes a lot of sense to watch a video, for example, when you want to, I don't know, repair something. It's a lot easier to follow videos than reading a manual or something like that. What are the literacy requirements on the workplace, especially for lower literate adults? I think there's a lot of data already in the data set you could look at. One other thing is the question which language are reading or writing practices performed, and also in longer ongoing discussion if PIAAC covers relevant literacy practices, and can the measures be improved? For example, reading financial statements, you could argue that's more a numeracy practice than or it's reading and literacy and numeracy practice. Yeah, that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.